You have probably spent your entire life believing your mind was protecting you from pain, from failure, from heartbreak, from uncertainty. You trusted the voice inside your head because it sounded like you. It warned you, guided you, controlled your choices, shaped the way you see yourself and the way you see the world. But what if the very thing you trust the most has been quietly trapping you your entire life? What if your thoughts are not revealing reality clearly, but distorting reality through fear, conditioning, memory, and invisible emotional patterns you never consciously chose? The ancient Vedas warned about this thousands of years ago. They said the uncontrolled mind becomes a prison so convincing, most people never realize they are inside one. A prison without walls, without chains, without locked doors, because the prison exists inside thought itself. And slowly, without noticing, you stop living directly through awareness. You begin living through fear, through overthinking, through emotional reactions, through mental stories repeating endlessly inside your head. The mind becomes so loud, you forget there is something deeper beneath it, something silent, something untouched, something free. And tonight, you are about to see the invisible cage your thoughts may have been building around your life for years. Because once you truly understand what the mind has been doing to you, you may never experience your inner world the same way again. The mind was created to serve you, but it quietly became your master. The human mind was never meant to dominate your entire existence. According to the ancient Vedas, the mind was designed as a tool, something useful for helping you move through the physical world, solve problems, communicate with people, remember important things, learn new skills, and survive daily life. The mind was supposed to help consciousness experience life more clearly. It was meant to be an assistant, not a ruler. But somewhere in human history, something silently changed. People slowly stopped using the mind consciously and began identifying with it completely, without even realizing it was happening. Instead of observing thoughts, they became trapped inside them. Instead of noticing emotions and letting them pass naturally, they became emotionally controlled by every feeling that entered their mind. The inner voice in the head slowly became accepted as the true self. People stopped saying, "I am noticing fear," and started saying, "I am afraid." They stopped seeing thoughts as temporary mental activity and began treating every thought as truth. And this is where suffering quietly begins. Because the mind is unstable by nature, it changes constantly depending on mood, memory, fear, desire, insecurity, and outside circumstances. One moment it feels hopeful, motivated, and confident, and the next moment it falls into anxiety, doubt, or emotional exhaustion. One day it convinces you that your future will be beautiful, and another day it whispers that your life is falling apart. Sometimes it makes you feel powerful, and sometimes it makes you feel completely worthless. Yet despite this constant instability, most people trust every thought that enters their consciousness without ever stopping to question whether the thought is actually true. The Vedas warned that an uncontrolled mind behaves like a restless ruler, constantly demanding attention, stimulation, emotional reaction, and control over every situation. It keeps talking endlessly from the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep. It comments on everything you see. It judges people. It compares your life to others. It reminds you of embarrassing memories from years ago. It creates imaginary arguments inside your head. It predicts terrible futures that have not happened. It turns small problems into emotional disasters. It replays painful moments repeatedly until they feel larger than life itself. And after years of listening to this endless mental noise, most people no longer know the difference between reality and psychological interpretation. The mind starts creating a version of reality based more on fear and conditioning than on what is actually happening in the present moment. A person may walk into a room and immediately think everyone is judging them, even when nobody is paying attention. Someone may receive a short message from a loved one and instantly imagine rejection or abandonment. Another person may lie awake all night, worrying about situations that never happen at all. This is how the mind slowly becomes a master, instead of a servant. It controls mood. It controls identity. It controls perception. It controls emotional reactions. It controls how life itself is experienced. And because most people never step outside their thoughts long enough to observe this process clearly, they slowly become servants to mental activity itself. Their happiness depends on thought. Their peace depends on thought. Their confidence depends on thought. Their entire sense of self depends on whatever the mind says in that particular moment. The mind becomes the center of reality. But the Vedas revealed something astonishing thousands of years ago. They taught that beneath the noise of the mind exists another dimension of awareness entirely, silent, observing, untouched, calm, and deeply still. A presence inside you that watches thoughts come and go without becoming trapped inside them. A deeper awareness that notices fear without becoming fear itself. An awareness that can witness sadness, anger, anxiety, excitement, or confusion without losing itself inside those emotions. This silent observer has been with you your entire life. It was there when you were a child. It was there during your happiest moments. It was there during heartbreak. It was there during fear. It was there through every version of yourself you have ever become. Everything in your life has changed over time. Your appearance, your emotions, your beliefs, your relationships, your dreams, your struggles, yet this quiet awareness has remained present through all of it. The Vedas taught that this awareness is your deeper nature, while the mind is only a temporary instrument passing through constant movement and change. But most people never notice this deeper presence because they are completely hypnotized by thought. The mind speaks so loudly that the silence underneath it becomes invisible. People become so addicted to mental noise that stillness begins to feel uncomfortable. Many cannot sit quietly for even a few minutes without needing distraction, entertainment, conversation, scrolling, or stimulation, because silence forces them to face the chaos happening inside their own mind. And yet, the moment a person begins noticing the observer within themselves, something powerful starts changing. For the first time, they realize they are not every thought they think. They begin seeing fear as mental activity instead of absolute truth. They begin noticing how quickly the mind creates unnecessary suffering. They begin understanding that thoughts can exist without controlling their entire identity. This is the beginning of inner freedom, not because the mind disappears completely, but because awareness is no longer trapped inside it. The Vedas never taught people to destroy the mind. They taught people to stop becoming unconscious servants to it. Because the moment you can observe the mind clearly instead of automatically obeying every thought it produces, the invisible prison begins to crack open. And for the first time in a very long time, you begin experiencing something the mind can never fully understand: inner stillness. Your thoughts were programmed long before you ever called them yours. Most people move through life believing their thoughts are completely personal. They assume every opinion, every fear, every emotional reaction, and every desire comes from their own independent mind. It feels natural to think this way because the voice inside your head sounds familiar. It speaks in your tone, it reacts automatically, it feels intimate and personal. But the ancient Vedas revealed something deeply unsettling about the human mind. They taught that many of the thoughts you call yours were silently planted inside you long before you became consciously aware of yourself. From the moment you entered the world, your mind began absorbing impressions from everything around you. Before you even understood language, your nervous system was already learning fear, safety, emotional patterns, and survival behaviors. As a child, you watched how people reacted to stress, love, anger, success, failure, rejection, and pain. Without realizing it, your mind started recording everything. The way your parents spoke to you shaped your inner voice. The way people treated you shaped your self-worth. The way society rewarded or rejected certain behaviors shaped your identity. The painful experiences you went through shaped your fears. The love you received, or did not receive, shaped your emotional needs. Slowly, layer by layer, the mind began constructing a psychological world inside you. And the most dangerous part is that this conditioning became invisible over time. You no longer noticed it happening because it became normal. A person who constantly heard criticism during childhood may grow up believing they are never enough, even when others admire them. Someone who experienced emotional abandonment may unconsciously expect every relationship to end in pain. A child raised around anxiety may eventually mistake constant worrying for intelligence and emotional tension for responsibility. Another person who grew up needing approval may spend their entire adult life becoming addicted to pleasing others while secretly feeling empty inside. The Vedas understood that the human mind becomes shaped by repeated impressions long before true awareness develops. These impressions slowly become mental patterns, and once a pattern repeats enough times, it stops feeling like conditioning and starts feeling like identity. This is why people often say things like, "This is just who I am." But many times, it is not who they truly are. It is who their conditioning trained them to become. The mind learns through repetition. If fear repeats long enough, fear becomes automatic. If insecurity repeats long enough, insecurity becomes natural. If emotional pain remains unresolved for years, the mind begins organizing life around protecting itself from future pain. And eventually, people begin living through unconscious patterns instead of conscious awareness. The Vedas described the mind almost like a field collecting impressions from every experience. Every emotional wound, every attachment, every humiliation, every desire, every moment of fear leaves a subtle mark inside consciousness. These marks shape perception itself. They influence how reality is interpreted before reality is even fully experienced. This is why two people can walk through the exact same situation and experience completely different emotional realities. One person sees opportunity while another sees danger. One sees rejection and moves on peacefully, while another carries emotional pain for years. One person experiences failure and becomes stronger, while another collapses into hopelessness. The outer event may be the same, but the inner conditioning changes everything, and most people never stop long enough to question the voice inside their own mind. They simply obey it automatically. If the mind says they are unlovable, they believe it. If the mind says the future is hopeless, they believe it. If the mind says they are weak, broken, behind in life, or unworthy of peace, they accept those thoughts as truth without realizing the thoughts themselves may simply be echoes of old conditioning. The Vedas warned that this unconscious identification with mental programming becomes one of the greatest causes of suffering, because when people remain unaware of their conditioning, they spend their entire lives reacting automatically instead of living consciously. They repeat the same emotional cycles. They attract the same painful patterns. They recreate the same fears. They sabotage the same opportunities. They carry the same invisible wounds into every new chapter of life. And after many years, they begin believing this repeated suffering is simply reality. But the Vedas taught that awareness changes everything. The moment you begin observing your thoughts instead of immediately believing them, something extraordinary begins happening inside your consciousness. You start noticing patterns that were invisible before. You begin seeing how certain fears repeat themselves again and again. You realize how many emotional reactions are not truly coming from the present moment, but from old memories, old wounds, and old conditioning still living inside the mind. You begin noticing that the mind is constantly recycling the past and projecting it onto the present. A painful betrayal from years ago quietly shapes how you trust people today. An old humiliation still controls how freely you express yourself. A childhood fear still affects how you see your worth. An emotional wound from the past still changes how you experience love. The mind keeps replaying unfinished emotional stories until awareness finally interrupts the cycle. This is why the Vedas placed such deep importance on self-observation, not judgment, not suppression, observation. Because the moment you can calmly witness your own mental patterns without becoming trapped inside them, the conditioning slowly begins losing its power over you, and this realization can completely transform the way you experience life. You stop treating every thought like absolute truth. You stop letting old fears define your future. You stop confusing conditioning with identity. You stop believing the mind completely understands reality. For the first time, you begin seeing the difference between awareness itself and the mental programming operating inside the mind. And in that moment, something inside you quietly begins waking up. Not the conditioned self, but the deeper awareness that existed before the conditioning was ever created. The mind can create suffering from futures that do not even exist yet. One of the strangest and most painful powers of the human mind is its ability to suffer over things that have not even happened. The body can become exhausted by imaginary futures. The heart can feel heavy because of situations that do not exist. A person can lose sleep over conversations that may never happen, failures that may never arrive, and disasters that the mind secretly created from fear alone. And most people never realize how much of their suffering comes not from reality itself, but from mental prediction. The ancient Vedas understood this deeply. They saw that the uncontrolled mind constantly projects fear onto the future because it is obsessed with protection and survival. The mind believes that if it keeps imagining every possible danger, it can somehow prevent pain from happening. But instead of protecting peace, this habit slowly destroys it. The mind begins creating emotional pain long before life unfolds naturally. A person may feel rejected before anyone has actually rejected them. They may fear abandonment before anyone has even left. They may imagine failure before they even begin trying. They may convince themselves they are not good enough before giving life a real chance. And because these thoughts repeat constantly, the body starts reacting as though the danger is already real. The chest tightens. The stomach becomes heavy, the heart races, sleep weakens, energy disappears, the nervous system remains trapped in silent tension. This is why many people feel emotionally exhausted even during ordinary days. They are not only carrying reality, they are carrying imagined futures created by the mind itself. The Vedas taught that the human mind has a powerful tendency to leave the present moment and wander into illusion. Instead of experiencing what is happening now, the mind keeps jumping toward what could go wrong tomorrow. It imagines loss before loss exists. It creates emotional storms from uncertainty. And slowly, people stop living directly through life itself and begin living through mental anticipation. This creates an invisible prison that most people never notice. A person may avoid expressing love because the mind predicts heartbreak. Another may avoid following their purpose because the mind predicts failure. Someone else may stay trapped in unhealthy situations because the mind fears uncertainty more than suffering itself. The tragedy is that many of the painful futures the mind creates never actually happen the way it imagined them, yet the suffering still becomes real inside the body because the mind keeps replaying the fear repeatedly until the nervous system believes the danger is already present. The Vedas recognized that fear grows strongest when awareness disappears. When consciousness becomes fully hypnotized by thought, the mind begins controlling emotional reality completely. A single fearful idea can dominate an entire day. One imagined future can create hours of anxiety. A small uncertainty can become an emotional disaster inside the mind. And over time, this changes how a person experiences existence itself. They stop trusting life. They stop feeling safe in the present moment. They stop relaxing deeply. They stop enjoying ordinary moments because the mind constantly whispers about future problems. Even during beautiful experiences, the mind quietly searches for danger. Someone may finally achieve something they once dreamed about, yet the mind immediately begins worrying about losing it. Another person may enter a loving relationship, but instead of experiencing the connection fully, they become trapped in fear about how it could eventually end. Someone may finally find peace for a brief moment, but the mind quickly interrupts by asking, "What if this does not last?" The mind struggles to remain present because it believes control creates safety. But the Vedas taught something completely different. They taught that true peace does not come from controlling the future. It comes from becoming fully conscious of the present moment, without constantly escaping into imagined fear. Because reality is usually much lighter than the mind's predictions about reality, the mind says disaster is coming. The present moment says you are still breathing. The mind says everything will collapse. The present moment says nothing dangerous is happening right now. The mind says you cannot handle what is ahead. The present moment reminds you that you have survived every difficult moment that once felt impossible. The Vedas did not teach people to stop planning or thinking about the future completely. They understood practical thinking is necessary for life, but they warned against psychological obsession with imagined suffering. They warned against becoming emotionally trapped inside futures that only exist inside thought, because when fear controls the mind long enough, a person stops truly living. They become mentally absent from their own existence. The sunrise no longer feels peaceful because the mind is busy worrying. Conversations lose depth because attention is trapped in overthinking. Even rest becomes difficult because the mind keeps searching for future threats. And eventually, people begin believing this constant inattention is normal. But the Vedas said it is not normal. It is unconsciousness. It is awareness becoming lost inside endless mental projection. And the moment a person begins observing this process clearly, something powerful starts changing inside them. They begin noticing how often fear appears before reality. They realize how many painful emotions were created by imagined scenarios instead of present truth. They begin understanding that not every thought deserves belief. This awareness creates space between consciousness and fear. And inside that space, something beautiful begins returning. Stillness, clarity, breathing room inside the mind. For the first time in years, a person begins experiencing moments where they are no longer trapped inside tomorrow. They begin feeling life directly again, instead of filtering everything through anxiety about what might happen next. The Vedas taught that this is where inner freedom quietly begins, not when the future becomes perfectly certain, but when awareness becomes stronger than fear itself. The greatest prison is invisible because the mind built it from within. The most dangerous prison in human life is not made of iron bars, locked doors, or concrete walls. The greatest prison is invisible, silent, and deeply personal. It exists inside the mind itself. And what makes this prison so powerful is that most people never realize they are living inside it. They wake up inside the same thoughts every morning. They carry the same fears every day. They repeat the same emotional patterns every year. And slowly, this inner repetition becomes their entire reality. The ancient Vedas understood that human beings are not only trapped by external problems. Most people are trapped internally by unconscious mental conditioning, emotional wounds, fears, attachments, and psychological illusions they have carried for so long that they now mistake them for truth. The prison is built slowly. One painful memory becomes a fear. That fear becomes a habit. That habit becomes a belief. And eventually, the belief becomes identity. A person gets rejected once, and the mind quietly says, "You are not lovable." Someone fails at something important, and the mind whispers, "You will never succeed." A painful betrayal happens, and the mind decides nobody can truly be trusted. And because these thoughts repeat constantly, they begin shaping how reality itself is experienced. This is how the invisible prison grows stronger over time, not through physical chains, but through repeated mental patterns. The Vedas taught that the mind is capable of creating an entire false world inside consciousness. A world built from fear, insecurity, comparison, memory, and emotional attachment. And once a person becomes fully identified with this inner world, they stop seeing life clearly. They no longer experience reality directly. They experience reality through the filter of conditioning. This is why two people can stand in the exact same situation while living in completely different emotional realities. One person enters a room and feels confident and peaceful. Another enters the same room and feels judged, anxious, and unsafe. One person sees challenge as growth. Another sees challenge as proof they are failing. One person experiences loneliness and uses it for self-discovery. Another experiences loneliness and believes they are unworthy of love. The outer world may remain the same, but the inner prison changes everything. And the frightening part is that most people defend their prison without realizing it. They protect their fears because the fears feel familiar. They repeat painful habits because the habits feel safe. They hold on to emotional suffering because suffering becomes part of identity. Even when life offers new possibilities, the mind often rejects them because unconsciousness prefers familiarity over freedom. A person may desperately want peace, yet continue feeding anxious thoughts every day. They may want love, yet keep building emotional walls around their heart. They may want freedom, yet continue obeying the same fearful mental patterns that keep them trapped. The prison survives through unconscious repetition, and over time the walls become so normal that people stop noticing them completely. This is why many human beings feel emotionally exhausted even when nothing terrible is happening externally. Their suffering is no longer coming mainly from life itself. It is coming from the non-stop pressure of mental activity inside them. The mind keeps replaying old pain, predicting future problems, comparing their life to others, criticizing their identity, and searching for danger even during peaceful moments. The prison follows them everywhere. It follows them into relationships, into work, into sleep, into silence, into success, into loneliness. Even beautiful moments become difficult to fully enjoy because the mind refuses to stop controlling the experience. Someone watches a sunset but cannot stop overthinking. Someone spends time with loved ones while mentally replaying old fears. Someone finally achieves their dream, yet still feels empty inside because the mind immediately creates a new problem to chase. The Vedas saw this clearly thousands of years ago. They understood that the uncontrolled mind constantly keeps human beings psychologically imprisoned by dragging attention away from the present moment and trapping consciousness inside endless thought. The mind says, you will only feel peace when life becomes perfect. You will only feel worthy when others approve of you. You will only feel complete when you achieve more. You will only feel safe when the future becomes certain. But the future never becomes completely certain. Life never becomes perfectly controlled, and the mind never stops demanding more. So the prison continues, and many people spend their entire lives waiting for peace while unconsciously feeding the very mental patterns destroying it. But the Vedas offered a profound truth that changes everything once it is truly understood. They taught that the prison begins weakening the moment awareness enters it, because unconscious thoughts survive through automatic belief. The mind remains powerful only when every thought is treated as truth without observation. But the moment you step back and calmly witness the mind itself, something extraordinary happens. You begin noticing the patterns. You begin seeing how often fear repeats itself. You begin realizing how many thoughts are exaggerated, distorted, or completely imagined. You begin understanding that the mind has been narrating reality instead of simply observing it, and this awareness creates distance. For the first time, there is space between you and the mental noise. A fearful thought appears, but instead of instantly becoming trapped inside it, you notice it. An old insecurity rises, but instead of fully identifying with it, you observe it. A painful memory returns, but instead of drowning inside it completely, you remain aware of the observer behind it. This is where inner freedom quietly begins, not because the mind disappears overnight, but because awareness is no longer completely hypnotized by it. The Vedas taught that liberation does not come from escaping life. It comes from seeing through the illusion the mind has created around life. It comes from realizing that many of the walls imprisoning human beings were built internally through unconscious thought, fear, attachment, and conditioning. And once a person begins seeing this clearly, something powerful starts changing inside them. The prison no longer feels permanent because they finally realize the door was never truly locked. The voice in your head keeps strengthening an identity that is not truly you. One of the deepest illusions the mind creates is the illusion of identity. From the moment people begin becoming aware of themselves, the mind slowly starts building a story called me. It collects memories, emotions, labels, achievements, failures, insecurities, desires, fears, and experiences, and then combines all of them into a psychological image that feels solid and permanent. And after many years, most people become completely attached to this mental version of themselves. They say, "This is who I am. This is my personality. This is just how I think. This is how life has always been for me." But the ancient Vedas questioned this entire idea very deeply. They asked something most people never stop long enough to consider. If everything about you keeps changing, then what exactly are you truly calling yourself? Your body changes over time. Your emotions change constantly. Your opinions change. Your desires change. Your beliefs change. Even your personality changes depending on age, pain, experience, and environment. The person you were 10 years ago is not the same person you are today. Your thoughts are different, your fears are different, your priorities are different. Yet despite all these changes, something inside you has remained present through every version of yourself you have ever become. The Vedas pointed toward this deeper awareness as the real essence beneath the false identity created by the mind. Not the temporary character, not the emotional story, not the collection of labels and memories, but the silent awareness watching all of it. The mind, however, does not want you to discover this easily because the ego survives through attachment to identity. It constantly needs definition, control, and recognition. So the voice inside your head keeps rebuilding the sense of me every single day. It reminds you of your past. It reminds you of your pain. It reminds you of what others said about you. It reminds you of your mistakes. It reminds you of your achievements. It reminds you of what you fear losing. And slowly, without realizing it, people begin carrying an invisible psychological character everywhere they go. This character becomes fragile. It wants approval. It fears rejection. It fears criticism. It fears failure. It fears looking weak. It fears being ignored. It fears uncertainty, because uncertainty threatens the image the mind worked so hard to create. This is why even small situations can create intense emotional reactions. Sometimes a person is not reacting only to the present moment. They are reacting because the ego feels threatened. A simple disagreement suddenly feels personal. Criticism feels like an attack on identity. Failure feels like proof of worthlessness. Rejection feels like destruction. The mind takes everything personally because it is constantly trying to protect the image it created. The Vedas understood that much of human suffering comes from defending a false identity that was never truly stable to begin with. People spend years trying to maintain an image, impress others, prove themselves, protect their pride, and avoid anything that damages the ego, and this becomes exhausting. A person becomes afraid to be fully authentic because the mind worries how others will react. Someone hides their true emotions because the ego fears vulnerability. Another spends years chasing success not because their soul truly desires it, but because the identity wants validation. The mind creates a version of self that constantly needs reinforcement from the outside world. And because the outside world is always changing, the ego never feels fully secure. Even when people achieve what they once dreamed about, the mind quickly creates another identity to maintain. Someone becomes successful, and now they fear losing success. Someone becomes admired, and now they fear judgment. Someone enters a relationship, and now they fear abandonment. The ego survives by constantly creating psychological attachment. The Vedas taught that this attachment traps human beings in endless emotional instability because they begin confusing temporary mental identities with their deeper nature. But the truth is far deeper than the mind's story about who you are. You are not every thought you think. You are not every emotion you feel. You are not every label placed upon you. You are not your worst memory. You are not your fear. You are not your social image. You are not the constant mental narration happening inside your head. All of these things are changing experiences appearing within awareness. And the moment a person begins realizing this, something extraordinary begins happening inside them. The grip of the ego weakens. For the first time, they stop taking every thought completely seriously. They stop needing constant validation from others. They stop feeling emotionally destroyed by every opinion, rejection, or failure because they no longer believe their entire existence depends on protecting a mental image. This creates a completely different way of experiencing life. A person becomes lighter internally, less defensive, less reactive, less desperate for approval, less afraid of being misunderstood, because they slowly begin recognizing that the identity created by the mind is not their deepest truth. The Vedas describe the ego almost like a mask worn by consciousness, useful in the world, but dangerous when mistaken for the real self. The problem is not having an identity. Human beings naturally need names, personalities, roles, and responsibilities to function in life. The problem begins when awareness becomes completely trapped inside the identity and forgets the deeper presence beneath it. And this forgetting creates endless suffering, because the ego can never truly relax. It constantly compares, constantly defends, constantly worries, constantly seeks control, constantly asks, how am I being seen? Am I enough? What if I lose this? What if I fail? What if others reject me? The mind keeps strengthening the false self until people become emotionally imprisoned by it. But the Vedas taught that freedom begins the moment awareness steps back and quietly observes the identity itself. You begin noticing the roles you play. You begin noticing the emotional masks you wear. You begin noticing how often fear is connected to protecting the ego, and slowly, a deeper stillness begins appearing underneath all the mental performance. For the first time, you stop trying so hard to become someone, and you begin reconnecting with the awareness that was already whole before the mind ever created an identity at all. The mind keeps promising peace tomorrow, so you never feel it today. One of the most deceptive things the mind does is convince you that peace exists somewhere in the future. It whispers that happiness is always one more achievement away, one more relationship away, one more success away, one more change away. It tells you that once life finally becomes perfect, calmness will naturally arrive. And because this promise feels believable, most people spend their entire lives chasing emotional completion somewhere ahead of them, never realizing the mind keeps moving the destination every time they get close. The ancient Vedas understood this deeply. They saw that the uncontrolled mind survives through constant craving. It is always searching for something else to hold on to, because stillness feels threatening to the ego. The moment the mind becomes quiet, people may finally begin seeing themselves clearly, and the ego fears that silence. So instead, the mind keeps creating endless desires, endless goals, endless emotional attachments, and endless conditions for happiness. It says, you will finally relax when you make more money. You will finally feel complete when someone loves you. You will finally feel worthy when people admire you. You will finally feel peaceful when all problems disappear. But when one desire is fulfilled, another immediately appears. A person spends years chasing success, believing success will bring peace, but after achieving it, the mind quickly creates new fears, new comparisons, and new insecurities. Now they worry about losing what they gained. Someone longs deeply for love, believing a relationship will finally heal their loneliness. But after entering the relationship, the mind begins creating fears of rejection, abandonment, or emotional disappointment. The mind never truly arrives anywhere because its nature is movement. And this creates a painful cycle where people spend most of their lives psychologically absent from the present moment. Instead of experiencing life directly, They constantly postpone peace into the future. They say, I will rest later. I will be happy later. I will enjoy life later. I will finally feel enough later. But later never fully comes, because the mind always creates another condition before allowing peace. The Vedas taught that this endless chasing slowly drains the human spirit. A person becomes addicted to becoming instead of simply being. They stop noticing the quiet beauty already existing around them because the mind keeps telling them something is still missing. Even when life offers small, peaceful moments, the mind interrupts by focusing on what has not yet been achieved. Someone sits with family, but mentally they are trapped inside worries about tomorrow. Someone watches the rain, but the mind keeps replaying unfinished problems. Someone finally reaches a major goal, yet still feels restless inside because the mind instantly creates another destination. This is why many people secretly feel empty even after getting what they once desperately wanted, because the problem was never only external. The deeper problem was the mind's inability to remain present without constantly searching for something else. The Vedas saw that the mind constantly creates psychological hunger. It tells people they are incomplete exactly as they are. It makes them believe their value depends on achievement, recognition, possessions, beauty, status, relationships, or control over life itself. And because of this, people become emotionally dependent on external conditions for inner peace. Their mood rises and falls with circumstances. Their identity rises and falls with success. Their self-worth rises and falls with approval from others. The mind ties peace to temporary things, even though temporary things can never create lasting stability. This is why even successful people often remain internally restless. The outside world may change, but the mind continues operating from the same patterns of fear, desire, comparison, and dissatisfaction. The Vedas describe this state almost like an endless thirst. No matter how much the mind receives, it keeps asking for more because it believes completion exists somewhere outside the present moment. And modern life strengthens this illusion constantly. People are taught to chase non-stop: more money, more beauty, more attention, more productivity, more validation, more stimulation. The world rarely teaches human beings how to simply sit peacefully with themselves without needing constant movement, so the mind becomes addicted to future-based living. It stops experiencing life directly. It stops appreciating ordinary moments. It stops feeling content without external stimulation, and eventually, people forget what inner stillness even feels like. The Vedas did not teach that desires themselves are evil. Human beings naturally have goals, dreams, responsibilities, and emotional needs. The problem begins when the mind becomes emotionally convinced that peace can only exist after desire is fulfilled, because then peace becomes permanently delayed. The mind says, not now, later, not here, somewhere else, not as you are, as someone better. And slowly, the present moment starts feeling like nothing more than a waiting room for future happiness. But the future is always moving. The Vedas taught something completely different. They taught that real peace is not created by finally controlling every part of life. It emerges when awareness becomes free from constant psychological craving. It appears when the mind stops demanding that every moment becomes something else before it can be accepted. Because life itself is happening now, not tomorrow, not after perfection, not after complete certainty. Now, the breath you are taking now, the silence around you now, the experience of being alive now. The mind overlooks all of this because it is obsessed with reaching somewhere else. But awareness notices what the mind ignores: the warmth of sunlight, the sound of rain, the stillness between thoughts, the peace hidden inside ordinary moments. The Vedas believed that human beings suffer deeply because they are mentally absent from their own lives. They keep sacrificing the present moment for an imagined future where peace will supposedly arrive permanently. But even when the future comes, the mind remains unsatisfied because dissatisfaction itself has become part of its conditioning. This is why the mind can never fully deliver the peace it promises. It keeps moving the finish line, And the longer a person lives unconsciously inside this cycle, the more disconnected they become from simple presence. But something powerful happens when awareness finally sees this pattern clearly. A person begins noticing how often the mind postpones happiness. They begin realizing how much life they missed while mentally chasing the future. They begin understanding that the peace they were searching for was never completely absent. It was simply buried underneath endless mental noise and psychological craving. And for the first time, they stop asking life to become perfect before allowing themselves to breathe deeply. They stop needing every moment to improve before accepting it. They stop delaying inner peace until every fear disappears. Instead, they begin returning gently to the present moment itself. And in that return, something ancient begins awakening inside them, a quiet feeling that perhaps peace was never waiting somewhere far away. Perhaps it was waiting underneath the restless mind all along. Unhealed pain does not disappear. The mind simply learns how to hide it. One of the greatest illusions the mind creates is making people believe that ignored pain eventually disappears on its own. Most human beings do not truly heal their emotional wounds. They simply learn how to distract themselves from them. They stay busy. They keep moving. They bury themselves in work, entertainment, relationships, goals, noise, social media, and endless mental stimulation because slowing down feels dangerous. Silence feels dangerous. Stillness feels dangerous. Because, deep inside, they know there are emotions they have never fully faced. The ancient Vedas understood this hidden suffering deeply. They taught that pain which is not consciously understood does not leave the mind completely. It remains stored inside consciousness like an invisible weight, shaping thoughts, reactions, fears, behaviors, and emotional patterns from behind the scenes. And over time, the mind becomes extremely skilled at hiding this pain. A person may smile constantly while secretly feeling empty. Someone may appear strong while carrying years of silent exhaustion. Another may seem emotionally detached, not because they feel nothing, but because feeling became too painful long ago. The mind adapts to unresolved pain by building defenses around it. Sometimes those defenses look like anger. Sometimes they look like perfectionism. Sometimes they look like emotional numbness. Sometimes they look like people-pleasing. Sometimes they look like constant overthinking. Sometimes they look like pretending everything is fine. But underneath all these behaviors, there is often unhealed emotional pain quietly asking to be seen. The Vedas taught that the mind carries impressions from every major emotional experience. Every heartbreak, betrayal, humiliation, rejection, abandonment, fear, and unresolved grief leaves subtle marks inside consciousness. These impressions continue influencing behavior long after the original moment has passed. This is why people often repeat the same painful patterns without understanding why. Someone who was deeply hurt may unconsciously push love away while desperately craving connection. A person who experienced rejection may constantly seek validation from others while never feeling fully enough. Someone who grew up emotionally unsafe may struggle to relax even during peaceful moments because the nervous system still expects danger. The pain remains alive underneath the surface, and the mind works constantly to avoid fully feeling it. This is why many people become uncomfortable when life slows down. The moment silence appears, buried emotions begin rising toward awareness. Old memories return, hidden sadness surfaces, unresolved fears become visible. The mind immediately searches for distraction because it believes facing pain will destroy the person completely. But the Vedas taught something very different. They taught that pain remains powerful, mainly when it stays unconscious. What is hidden controls behavior from the shadows. What is denied continues shaping reality silently. What is avoided keeps repeating itself in different forms. This is why human beings often experience the same emotional suffering again and again, even with different people and different situations. The faces change, the locations change, the years pass, but the inner pattern remains the same. Someone keeps attracting emotionally unavailable people. Someone keeps sabotaging opportunities out of fear. Someone keeps abandoning themselves to please others. Someone keeps living with anxiety that never fully leaves. And eventually, the mind begins turning pain into identity. A person no longer says, "I experienced pain." They begin saying, "This is just who I am." This is how suffering becomes deeply rooted inside consciousness. The Vedas warn that when pain remains unseen for too long, the mind begins organizing life around protecting itself from future emotional wounds. A person becomes hyper-alert. They overthink constantly. They fear vulnerability. They become emotionally guarded. They avoid risks. They stop trusting life fully because the mind is trying to prevent old pain from happening again. But in trying to avoid pain completely, people often close themselves off from life itself. They stop feeling deeply, stop opening their hearts, stop trusting naturally, stop experiencing the present moment fully. The mind believes it is protecting them, but often it is imprisoning them. This is why the Vedas placed such deep importance on awareness and self-observation. Not because awareness magically erases pain overnight, but because awareness finally brings hidden suffering into the light. And once pain is fully seen without resistance, something begins changing. The emotional wound no longer remains buried in darkness, controlling everything unconsciously. For the first time, a person begins understanding themselves more deeply. They begin seeing why certain fears exist, why certain reactions repeat, why certain attachments feel so strong, why certain situations trigger overwhelming emotions. And instead of running from themselves, they slowly begin sitting with their own inner world honestly. This process is not always comfortable, because when buried emotions finally rise to the surface, the mind often becomes restless. It wants escape, it wants distraction, it wants noise. The ego fears vulnerability because vulnerability removes the masks it spent years building. But the Vedas taught that healing does not happen through avoidance. It happens through conscious presence, through allowing awareness to remain with pain without becoming consumed by it. For many people, this may be the first time in their entire lives they truly stop and listen to themselves beneath the noise of the world, beneath the constant distractions, beneath the mental performance, beneath the roles they play for others. And what they often discover is heartbreaking. They realize how long they have been carrying silent sadness, how long they have ignored their own emotional wounds, how long they have tried to appear strong while feeling deeply tired inside. But alongside this sadness, another realization begins appearing quietly. The awareness observing the pain is not broken. The awareness itself remains whole. The Vedas taught that suffering belongs to the movements of the mind, but awareness itself remains untouched beneath the storm. Thoughts may become chaotic, emotions may become heavy, pain may rise and fall in waves, but the deeper consciousness, observing all of it, still exists silently underneath. This realization changes everything, because now a person no longer feels completely trapped inside their pain. They begin seeing pain as an experience moving through awareness instead of as their permanent identity. And slowly, the grip of old suffering begins loosening, not through force, not through pretending, not through suppression, but through finally allowing truth to be seen clearly. The Vedas believed that real healing begins the moment a person stops running from their own inner world, because hidden pain survives through unconsciousness. But awareness slowly dissolves what fear spent years trying to hide. And for the first time in a very long time, the person begins feeling something they thought they had lost forever: inner softness, inner honesty, and the possibility that peace may still exist beneath all the pain they carried for so many years. The mind fears silence because silence begins, exposing the illusion. Most people believe silence is empty. They believe silence means boredom, loneliness, or the absence of something important. This is why the modern world has become completely addicted to noise. Everywhere people go, they carry stimulation with them. Music plays constantly, notifications never stop, screens glow day and night, conversations continue endlessly. Even when people are alone, they immediately reach for distraction because silence feels uncomfortable. But the ancient Vedas understood something most human beings never realize. The mind is not afraid of silence because silence is empty. The mind fears silence because silence begins exposing everything the noise was hiding. As long as the mind remains constantly distracted, a person never has to fully face themselves. The endless stimulation keeps awareness occupied. It prevents deeper observation. It keeps buried emotions hidden beneath movement and mental activity. But the moment silence appears, something unusual starts happening. The inner world becomes louder. Thoughts become more noticeable. Fears become clearer. Emotional pain begins rising to the surface. Restlessness becomes impossible to ignore. And this is why so many people struggle to sit quietly, even for a few minutes. The moment the external noise disappears, they suddenly meet the chaos inside their own mind. The Vedas saw this very clearly. They understood that the uncontrolled mind survives through constant movement and distraction. It jumps endlessly from one thought to another, one desire to another, one fear to another, because stillness threatens the illusion it has created. The ego fears silence because silence weakens mental control. When a person finally becomes still, they begin noticing how repetitive the mind actually is. The same worries repeat every day. The same fears replay constantly. The same emotional patterns return again and again. The same inner voice keeps commenting on everything non-stop. And for the first time, people realize they are not living in peace internally. They are living in mental noise. The frightening part is that many human beings become so accustomed to this noise that they mistake it for normal life. They do not even remember what inner stillness feels like anymore. Their mind has been active for so many years that silence begins feeling unfamiliar, almost threatening. This is why many people constantly need entertainment, scrolling, conversations, or stimulation before sleeping. They cannot comfortably sit alone with their own consciousness because silence slowly removes the distractions, protecting them from themselves. The Vedas taught that silence acts almost like a mirror, not a mirror for the body, but a mirror for the mind. In silence, people begin seeing their hidden attachments, their emotional dependence, their fears, their loneliness, their unresolved pain, their endless craving for control, their addiction to thought itself. And at first, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. A person may sit quietly and suddenly realize how restless their mind truly is. They may notice how quickly thoughts begin racing toward worries, regrets, fantasies, judgments, or fears. They may see how difficult it feels to simply remain present without mentally escaping somewhere else. The Vedas believe this discomfort is important because it reveals the difference between awareness and unconscious mental activity. Most people are so identified with thought that they never step back far enough to observe the machinery of the mind itself. Silence creates that opportunity. For the first time, a person begins witnessing the constant movement happening inside them. And this observation changes everything. Because once the mind is seen clearly, its illusion begins weakening. The Vedas never taught that silence was merely the absence of sound. They described silence as a doorway into deeper awareness, a sacred space where the noise of the ego slowly loses its power and consciousness begins reconnecting with something deeper than thought. Beneath the mental chatter, beneath the emotional storms, beneath the endless inner commentary, there is another presence, still, quiet, untouched. The Vedas believed this silent awareness is closer to your true nature than the restless mind ever was. But the mind fears this discovery because the ego survives through noise, identity, comparison, and constant psychological activity. Silence begins dissolving these structures slowly. In deep stillness, the mind loses some of its control because awareness is no longer completely hypnotized by thought. This is why many ancient sages, seekers, and spiritual teachers spent long periods in silence and solitude, not because they hated life or wanted to escape the world, but because silence allowed them to finally hear reality without distortion. When the mind becomes quiet, something extraordinary begins happening. Ordinary moments become deeper. Breathing feels more alive. Nature feels more peaceful. Emotions become easier to understand. Thoughts lose some of their power. Inner tension starts softening. The person begins noticing things the restless mind constantly overlooked. The beauty of stillness, the peace hidden inside the present moment, the calmness that exists beneath mental movement. The Vedas taught that human beings suffer not only because of external problems, but because they are separated from this deeper silence within themselves. The mind keeps dragging attention outward toward distraction, fear, desire, and endless stimulation, while awareness quietly waits beneath all the noise. And the longer a person avoids silence, the stronger the illusion of the mind becomes, because noise keeps consciousness asleep, but silence begins waking it up. This is why many people experience unexpected emotions when they finally slow down. Old grief may rise, anxiety may become visible, hidden exhaustion may suddenly appear. The mind may become uncomfortable because silence removes the distractions that once covered these emotions. But the Vedas taught that this is not failure. This is revelation. For the first time, truth is becoming visible, and only what is seen clearly can truly heal. The person slowly realizes that the chaos was always there beneath the surface. Silence did not create it. Silence simply exposed it. And once awareness begins calmly witnessing the inner world without running away, something beautiful starts changing. The mind slowly loses its grip. Thoughts become less overwhelming. Inner space begins appearing between awareness and reaction. The nervous system softens. Breathing deepens. Presence returns. And in rare, quiet moments, a person may suddenly experience something they have not felt in years. Not excitement, not stimulation, not distraction, but pure inner stillness. A silence that does not feel empty. A silence that feels alive. The Vedas describe this silence as sacred because it reconnects human beings with the awareness hidden beneath the mind, not the fearful identity, not the restless ego, not the endless thinking, but the deeper consciousness that was always present before the noise began. And perhaps this is why the mind fears silence so much, because in silence, the illusion finally starts breaking apart. The more the mind tries controlling life, the more fear it secretly creates. The human mind is deeply obsessed with control. It wants certainty about the future. It wants guarantees about relationships, success, health, money, and life itself. It wants to know what will happen next, because uncertainty makes the ego feel unsafe. The mind believes that if it can predict enough, plan enough, analyze enough, and control enough, then suffering can finally be avoided. But the ancient Vedas understood something most people spend their entire lives resisting. Life was never meant to be fully controlled. Everything in existence is constantly changing. People change, relationships change, bodies change, emotions change, circumstances change, time changes everything. And yet, the mind keeps fighting against this truth every single day. It wants permanence in a temporary world. It wants certainty inside an unpredictable existence. And this endless resistance quietly becomes one of the deepest causes of human suffering. The mind constantly asks, what if something goes wrong? What if I lose this? What if people leave? What if the future becomes painful? What if life does not happen the way I planned? And because these questions never fully end, the mind remains trapped in hidden tension almost all the time. This is why many people cannot fully relax, even during peaceful moments. The mind is always preparing for possible danger. It keeps scanning life for future threats because it believes control creates safety. But the more the mind tries controlling life, the more fear it secretly creates. A person becomes afraid of uncertainty, afraid of change, afraid of losing control, afraid of outcomes they cannot predict. And slowly, life begins feeling emotionally exhausting because the mind treats uncertainty as an enemy instead of a natural part of existence. The Vedas taught that the uncontrolled mind creates suffering not only from pain itself, but from resistance to pain. It fights reality constantly. It demands that life obey its expectations. It creates rigid ideas about how things should happen, how people should behave, and how the future should unfold. And whenever reality moves differently than expected, the mind suffers deeply. A relationship changes unexpectedly. Plans fall apart. Someone leaves. Failure happens. Loss arrives. Time moves in ways the ego cannot control, and the mind immediately reacts with fear, anger, anxiety, or emotional collapse because its illusion of control has been threatened. The Vedas saw that much of human suffering comes from this invisible war between the mind and reality itself. Reality flows naturally. The mind resists that flow constantly. Reality changes. The mind demands permanence. Reality remains uncertain. The mind demands guarantees. And because life never fully submits to mental control, fear becomes permanent inside the ego. This is why overthinking becomes endless for many people. The mind keeps searching for the perfect answer, the perfect plan, the perfect certainty that will finally allow it to relax. But even after solving one problem, another appears because the deeper issue was never the external situation alone. The deeper issue was the mind's inability to surrender to the natural uncertainty of life. The Vedas did not teach passive weakness or emotional helplessness. They understood practical action is necessary. Human beings must still make decisions, prepare wisely, protect themselves when needed, and take responsibility for life. But they warned against psychological obsession with control, because there is a difference between conscious action and fearful control. Conscious action comes from clarity. Fearful control comes from insecurity. Conscious action remains flexible. Fearful control becomes rigid. Conscious action accepts uncertainty. Fearful control fights uncertainty constantly. The mind believes that if it worries enough, it can prevent pain from happening. But often, the worrying itself becomes a greater source of suffering than the actual event ever would have been. A person ruins today worrying about tomorrow. They destroy peaceful moments trying to mentally control futures that do not yet exist. They replay conversations endlessly, trying to control how others see them. They overanalyze relationships, trying to control emotional outcomes. And eventually, the mind becomes trapped inside non-stop tension. The nervous system never fully rests. The body remains tight. The heart feels heavy. Thoughts become exhausting. This is why many people secretly feel tired all the time, even when they are physically safe. The mind is carrying the impossible burden of trying to control life itself. But life cannot be fully controlled. The Vedas taught that true peace begins appearing when a person finally stops demanding certainty from an uncertain world. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because awareness becomes strong enough to remain calm within it. This changes everything internally. A person begins understanding that they cannot control every outcome, but they can control whether they remain completely lost inside fear. They cannot stop all pain from existing, but they can stop mentally multiplying suffering through endless resistance and overthinking. For the first time, they begin loosening their psychological grip on life. And strangely, this surrender creates more peace than control ever did, because the mind finally stops fighting reality every moment. The Vedas describe surrender not as weakness, but as alignment with the deeper flow of existence, a recognition that life itself is moving through constant change, whether the ego accepts it or not. The river flows, time moves, people enter and leave, seasons change, moments rise and disappear, and the more awareness relaxes into this truth, the less fear dominates the mind. This does not mean sadness never appears. It does not mean pain disappears forever. It does not mean difficult experiences stop happening, but it means the person is no longer psychologically at war with reality itself. And this changes the entire inner experience of life. The mind slowly becomes quieter. Overthinking weakens. Fear loses some of its control. The nervous system softens. The present moment becomes easier to experience. For the first time in years, a person begins realizing that peace was never created by controlling everything around them. Peace appears when the mind finally stops trying to imprison life inside its endless demand for certainty. The Vedas taught that the ego fears uncertainty because uncertainty reminds it that it is not truly in control of existence. But awareness itself does not fear uncertainty in the same way. Awareness can remain present even when answers are incomplete, even when the future is unknown, even when life changes unexpectedly. And perhaps this is one of the deepest forms of inner freedom, to finally stop trying to control every wave in the ocean, and instead learn how to remain present within the movement of life itself. The moment you stop believing every thought, the prison starts falling apart. Most people spend their entire lives believing every thought that enters their mind. If the mind says they are not enough, they believe it. If the mind says the future will fail, they believe it. If the mind says they are broken, behind in life, unloved, unsafe, or trapped forever, they accept those thoughts as reality without ever questioning where those thoughts came from. And this unconscious belief is what gives the mind so much power. The ancient Vedas taught that the human mind becomes dangerous not because thoughts exist, but because awareness becomes completely hypnotized by them. A thought appears, and instantly the person becomes emotionally absorbed inside it. Fear arises, and they become fear. Anger appears, and they become anger. Sadness comes, and they become sadness. The mind speaks, and consciousness obeys automatically. This is how the prison survives, not through physical walls, but through unconscious identification with thought. The mind creates stories constantly. Stories about yourself, stories about other people, stories about the future, stories about the past, stories about failure, stories about love, stories about suffering, and after years of repetition, these stories begin feeling absolutely real. A person may spend years believing they are weak, simply because the mind repeated the idea long enough. Someone may feel permanently damaged because painful experiences shaped their inner narrative. Another person may secretly believe they will never find peace because the mind keeps replaying hopeless thoughts every day. The Vedas understood that the mind is constantly creating psychological illusions and emotional interpretations, yet most people never step back far enough to observe the process itself. They become trapped inside mental narration without realizing that thoughts are not always truth. This realization changes everything. Because the moment awareness begins observing thought instead of automatically believing it, the prison starts weakening immediately. For the first time, a person notices the voice inside their head instead of becoming completely lost inside it. They begin seeing how often the mind exaggerates fear, how often it predicts disasters that never happen, how often it repeats old pain, how often it creates emotional suffering from imagined futures, how often it attacks identity through insecurity and comparison. And suddenly, a powerful question begins appearing inside consciousness. If I can observe these thoughts, then who is the observer? The Vedas believed this question opens the doorway to deeper awakening, because the observer itself is different from the mind. Thoughts constantly change. Emotions constantly move. Fear rises and falls. Desire rises and falls. Mental states come and go endlessly, but awareness remains present through all of it. There is something inside you that has been watching your entire life unfold silently from the beginning. It watched you as a child. It watched you during heartbreak. It watched you during confusion. It watched you during happiness. It watched every version of yourself come and go. And yet this awareness itself remained present beneath every experience. The Vedas taught that this deeper awareness is your true nature, while thoughts are temporary movements passing across consciousness like clouds moving across the sky. But because human beings become completely identified with the clouds, they forget the vast open sky behind them. This forgetting creates suffering. The mind becomes so loud that people stop noticing the silent awareness underneath it. They begin treating every fearful thought like reality itself. Every emotional reaction becomes absolute truth. Every mental story becomes identity. And slowly, the prison becomes stronger. But the prison begins cracking the moment awareness stops blindly obeying thought. Not because thoughts disappear completely, but because awareness is no longer trapped inside every thought that appears. A fearful idea may still arise, but now the person notices it calmly instead of drowning inside it. An insecure thought may appear, but awareness sees it without instantly turning it into identity. Painful memories may return, but instead of becoming completely consumed by them, the person remains connected to the observer beneath the emotional movement. This creates inner space, and that space changes everything. Because most human suffering happens when there is no distance between awareness and mental activity. Thoughts immediately control emotions. Emotions immediately control behavior. Fear immediately controls perception. But once awareness enters the process consciously, the mind slowly loses its absolute control over inner reality. The Vedas describe this almost like waking up from hypnosis. For years, the person believed every thought automatically. For years, they followed mental fear without question. For years, they allowed the mind to define identity, peace, worth, and reality itself. But now, something deeper begins awakening. A quiet awareness that watches thought without becoming imprisoned by it. This awakening is not always dramatic. Sometimes it happens slowly, in small moments of observation. A person notices how quickly anxiety appears. They notice how repetitive their fears are. They notice how the mind keeps searching for problems even during peaceful moments. They notice how emotional suffering often begins with unconscious thought. And little by little, the spell weakens. The mind still speaks, but awareness no longer worships every word. The Vedas never taught people to destroy the mind or force thoughts to disappear completely. Fighting the mind aggressively often creates even more inner conflict. Instead, they taught observation, calm, awareness, deep seeing. Because when awareness sees the mind clearly, unconsciousness cannot survive in the same way. The illusion begins dissolving naturally, and something beautiful starts returning to the human experience. Inner stillness. For the first time in years, the person experiences moments where they are simply present without being mentally dragged into endless fear, comparison, craving, or overthinking. They begin feeling life directly again. The sound of rain feels deeper. Silence feels peaceful instead of uncomfortable. Nature feels alive. Breathing feels calming. Ordinary moments begin carrying quiet beauty, because awareness is finally reconnecting with reality itself instead of constantly filtering reality through mental noise. The Vedas believe this is the beginning of true liberation. Not escaping the world, not becoming emotionally numb, not pretending pain no longer exists, but becoming free from complete psychological slavery to thought. This freedom changes how a person experiences everything. Fear still comes sometimes, but it no longer fully controls them. Pain still appears, but it no longer becomes permanent identity. Uncertainty still exists, but the mind no longer collapses so easily beneath it. There is now something deeper than thought, holding the center of consciousness together. A stillness the mind cannot fully disturb. And eventually, the person begins realizing something that completely transforms their understanding of themselves. They were never truly the prison. They were the awareness trapped inside it. And the moment awareness finally wakes up, the walls begin disappearing one thought at a time. And maybe that is the strangest truth of all. Your mind spent years convincing you that it was protecting you, while quietly keeping you trapped inside fear, overthinking, emotional noise, and endless mental struggle. It made you believe you were your anxiety, your past, your pain, your insecurity, your thoughts. But the Vedas whispered something completely different. They said the real you was never the chaos inside the mind. It was the silent awareness watching the chaos the entire time. And perhaps that is why no amount of achievement, distraction, control, or external success ever fully satisfied the deeper part of you. Because what your soul was truly searching for was not more noise. It was freedom from the noise. Tonight, after hearing all of this, do not try to force yourself into becoming perfectly peaceful overnight. Do not fight your thoughts aggressively. Do not hate your mind for being restless. The mind has simply been doing what it was conditioned to do for many years. Instead, begin observing, quietly, gently. Notice how often the mind creates fear before reality arrives. Notice how often it drags you away from the present moment. Notice how often it repeats old stories and old pain. Notice how much suffering is created not by life itself, but by unconscious attachment to thought. And in those moments of observation, something powerful begins happening. The prison weakens, because awareness is waking up. Little by little, you stop believing every thought. You stop carrying every fear. You stop treating every emotion like permanent truth. And for the first time in a very long time, you begin feeling space inside yourself again. Space to breathe. Space to rest. Space to simply exist without constantly fighting your own mind. The Vedas taught that peace was never something you had to create from the outside world. It was something hidden underneath the mental noise all along. Buried beneath fear. Buried beneath conditioning. Buried beneath endless thinking, waiting patiently for you to finally become still enough to notice it. So tonight, before you sleep, sit quietly for a moment, not to escape life, not to control the future, not to silence every thought, but simply to remember that beneath all the noise in your mind, there is still a part of you that remains untouched, silent, aware, still, and maybe that silent presence is who you truly were all along. If this video made you stop and look at your own mind differently, then don't let this awareness disappear the moment the video ends. Take a quiet moment and ask yourself, how much of my suffering was created by thoughts I never questioned? And if even one part of this message stayed with you tonight, write, "I am observing" in the comments, not for anyone else, but as a reminder to yourself that you are beginning to wake up from the noise. And if you want more deep ancient wisdom like this, slow, powerful truths that help you see beyond the illusion of the mind, subscribe to the Silent Vedas and continue this journey with us. Because sometimes the quietest truths change a human being forever.